Well, welcome everyone to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Director for Global Health here. After a decade of support to low-income countries for vaccination and with an upcoming replenishment in June, we thought it was a good time to reflect on GAVI's sources of financing in the past and take a look at the outlook for the future. More than any other organization in global health, GAVI has pioneered the use of innovative financing. Only a third of the funding was direct or traditional over the past decade, so I think that's a really interesting characteristic of GAVI. Today, we're really fortunate to have Alice Albright, who's the former CFO of GAVI and who worked together with many others to make the International Finance Facility for Immunization a reality. We're also honored to have Professor Michael Kramer of Harvard University here, who first published a paper on the advanced market commitment in 2001. So that's 10 years ago, maybe exactly. You can tell us what month you wrote it in. And who also served as the co-chair of CGD's 2003-5 working group on the AMC. And I've asked both speakers to reflect on the achievements of these mechanisms and, with the benefit of hindsight, discuss lessons learned and the outlook for the future. We'll then turn to the futurology portion of our program. I'll talk briefly about GAVI's past funding and its characteristics and talk through one potential scenario for the future. We're very, very honored to have Helen Evans and David Ferreira from the GAVI Alliance here today to describe their views of financing going forward. And finally, we've asked Deputy Assistant Administrator Amie Batson of USAID and one of the mothers of GAVI to reflect on today's program and the future. I hope you don't mind that I just called you the mother of GAVI, one of the mothers. And after that, we'll open for questions and discussion, and we'll close with a reception. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn over the podium to Alice Albright.
Where do you want me, Amanda? Here or here?
Wherever you prefer.
Okay, I'll do here. Okay. Is that working? Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank you all so much for including me. I feel like this is sort of old home week, or at least old home afternoon, and I'm going to have to avoid the temptation to stick around here all afternoon chatting with all of my buddies. I also think there should be some rule that I'm going to invent right now called the reverse order of present value discounting, meaning that any information that you might have had a long time ago is worth very little, and so I encourage you all to take that very much into consideration, worth very little and perhaps worth nothing. I left GAVI almost about 2 years ago, so very rusty, very rusty. But I will have a few things to say about IFIM. I look back, and I said this at GAVI when I was there. I think Helen may have heard me say this a number of times, as did Alex, that we would all look at the period of time that we had at GAVI as absolute highlights in our career. And I still feel that's very true for me at GAVI, and probably my highlight when I was at GAVI was working on the IFIM. And it started with a great meeting that we had in November 2003 in the Treasury in the UK, and they were clearly amongst the major movers and shakers behind the whole thing. And Tori Goodall was there, our old buddy, and I was invited with very little notice to come and sort of give a view on whether or not GAVI should be in a position to do the IFIM. And I spent a few minutes doing boxes and arrows and talking to our lawyers and whatnot. And it was clear to me that we should do the IFIM. So I walked in and I said, yes, of course we should do the IFIM. Not having a really good idea of exactly how, but I knew instinctively that we absolutely had to do it. And I've now heard a little bit about the evaluation that was just concluded, and it seems like it was a good idea. Let me share with you a few thoughts. I now work for the Export-Import Bank of the United States, which is our government's export credit agency. It's a 76-year-old institution. I'm the chief operating officer, and I would have what I would call a ringside seat on government difficulty at its finest, which has nothing to do with the administration or the leadership or any of the sort of personalities or personnel involved, but more how difficult it is to introduce new mechanisms into a government setting at least in our government, it is mighty, mighty difficult. You have to deal with OMB, you have to deal with the Office of Management and Budget, you've got to deal with the agency in whose turf that is, and often there's not usually one turf, there's usually multiple turfs in multiple different agencies. And then you have to go to the Hill, and then they all start disagreeing. And so it is incredibly difficult. And so when I think against a backdrop like that, and I do think that that backdrop is somewhat representative of what goes on sort of elsewhere in the world, it is truly amazing that IFM happened. And it is a real testament to the UK and Gates and a number of others, Tories, saying do it, do it, do it. And then I now see that there are 3 more governments that have joined it since we first started, and it's just tremendous validation. I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about what I thought we did well and what I thought we did less well, and then end with, and this is really where the heavily discounting part needs to come in, just some thoughts about how you guys might want to use it going forward. But some thoughts on what we did well. Early on, we had a fair amount of back and forth about, was this the IFF? Was it the IFM? Was it a mini version of the IFF? How was it different from the IFF? Could it ever be as big as the IFF? And I'm glad that we did not spend, with all due respect to those involved, an enormous amount of time debating that, because I think it became doable because it was limited and it was not the IFF, and we weren't trying to boil the ocean with it. We were trying to do something quite limited, demonstrate 1 or 2 things, get a few governments signed on, and put together a fairly contained mechanism. And I've taken that lesson forward in the idea that if you're going to do something as a pilot, make it containable, because it first of all increases the odds you're going to do it, but it also increases your ability to measure its success. Clearly, second point, strong muscular leadership behind a government, with a government, in the UK in our case, and also the Gates Foundation really being able to crack heads internationally on this was clearly obviously critical, wouldn't have happened without it. Third thing is that linking it to the idea of market shaping, which at the time was very sort of baked into the ethos of GAVI, why GAVI was created, clearly evident in how the vaccine and the pharmaceutical markets as a whole were developing relative to the needs for global health on the ground. Michael, you know much more about this than I do. But the notion of linking funding to a market gap to market shaping was very compelling. So that was an easily sellable story. Fourth thing I thought that we did well was setting up this IFM board to be a real oversight mechanism and to have the right kind of people on it who really knew what they were talking about in terms of financial management and could provide a very valuable, what I'll call, counterweight to the World Bank. Obviously, the World Bank was also critical. As I think many of you know, they fulfill the role of the Treasury Management agent. We spent a lot of time crafting the nitty-gritty of that relationship. In fact, we put it out to bid, which was not super popular at the time, but we did it anyway. And it was a very valuable and constructed to be sort of arm's length relationship. We also spent a lot of time early on establishing a really strong track record in the credit markets and spent a lot of time with the rating, with investors. We took the whole roadshow thing incredibly seriously. In fact, we tracked lots of miles on roadshows, but we treated every roadshow engagement as sort of a life or death matter, and we didn't just assume that all of a sudden these investors were going to show up just because we had this sort of new wacky thing called IFM. We were very, very serious about that. And then the other thing that we did, and we did this very deliberately, is we made it scalable. In other words, we hoped and we had this instinct that IFM was going to become a durable thing within the GAVI world, that it wasn't just going to become sort of a one-off, that's nice, it's over, move on to the next thing, that it could be replenishable. We made it scalable in the sense that other donors could come in by accession agreements. We did not cap the amount of debt that it could raise relative to its overall leverage ratios. We didn't cap its balance sheet. We hoped that under sort of prudential management it would grow and become sort of a core funding thing with GAVI. And I think some of that has really been borne out, particularly with the 3 additional donors, which I was thrilled to see when I saw some of the stuff that I just looked at, the materials. What we could have done better. The top thing on my list was we overcomplicated some things. One of the things that became evident to us probably 6 months into it and became even more evident is that the process of packaging up the approvals from GAVI, taking them to the GAVI fund affiliate, getting them approved, taking them to the IFM board, getting them approved, making sure all the numbers matched was fairly torturous. I don't know if it's still torturous. A little less torturous, I'm glad to hear that. But it was fairly torturous and necessary for a variety of reasons, which I won't bore you with, to do with really the accounting and scoring through the Eurostat mechanism. But one of the things that began to worry me a little bit was that it was too torturous. And possibly, and it seemed to me almost that there was almost a disconnect between the need to only raise funds when they were absolutely necessary with all these lined up approvals, and the hope that it would signal to the vaccine manufacturers that all of a sudden we have all this money and we're ready to play, we're ready to buy. And so I was worried about that. So I'm glad that it sounds like that's been fixed. One of the things that was controversial was the cash programs, and could we really demonstrate the value of those relative to how the whole mechanism worked? I don't know where that's gone to. Another thing that I think we may not have done enough of in the sort of, let's call it, 08, 09 period was, and this was really in the height of the financial crisis, was go to our sort of best friend sovereigns within the IFM group at the time, the UK, Italy, France, and get them to be as vocal as they possibly could be about how durable the mechanism was during very bad budgetary times. And times haven't changed all that much since then. You could certainly go back to the UK and ask them to do the same thing. But one of the things that I think was very salient about it, and could continue to be salient because this recession is not going to be over anytime soon, is really make sure that you've got some very strong messaging around durability during bad budget periods. And I'm not sure that I wonder if we let that slip a little bit. I let that slip a little bit during this sort of 7, 8, 9 period. So those are some thoughts on what we could have done better. In terms of looking forward, and I'm, call me sort of slightly jaded and completely partial, I think that it remains one of the most effective mechanisms out there. And I'm very proud when I hear sort of in the back of my head, when I go to various meetings about development within the government, although it's not really part of our mandate at EximBank, I go anyway because I'm interested. But GAVI and the AMC and the IFM are regularly talked about as model development programs, which of course I'm very proud to hear. But one of the reasons why is its effectiveness, its low cost. In the case of the IFM, that's been very much borne out by the interest rates. Our hope was that we were going to be able to borrow on a package sort of composite basis relative to the borrowing spreads of the underlying sovereigns at just a tiny hair over where they were borrowing individually. And that's now come out true. I think the numbers have come in and it's just a hair over. I think that's a huge win, particularly when you think about the sovereign debt messes that are going on in Europe right now. The fact that IFM's borrowing spreads have not completely blown out is a huge win. The other point of effectiveness, and we started studying this early on, but I think the numbers have accumulated even forward now, is the sort of magnifying effect. I won't call it leverage because that's sort of a slightly imprecise term for this setting, but the sort of growth leverage between the amount of pledges that have been actually paid in, versus, it's like I think 500 and some now, versus the amount of debt that's been raised, which I think is about 3.5 billion by now. Okay, so the difference between 500 and some and 3.5 billion and some, about 7 times, is huge. Think about the capacity for the global health and immunization space to bring forward 6 times worth of funding. That's a huge win. Durability through budget cycles, I would stress that over and over and over again. It may not have quite so much play here, but it will certainly have play over in Europe. The ongoing appeal and accessibility to the credit markets and those fine borrowing spreads, I think the fact that IFM has done deals in all these currencies and all these different borrowing environments, through thick and thin, I knew we had to pull one deal. That was not a happy day when I had to tell Julian we couldn't do one deal. I was sort of quaking, but he got it. He didn't get too mad at me. But apart from that one thing, I did not see any sort of missing of the beat of accessing the credit markets. And again, during this environment, particularly when so many of the underlying sovereigns are European, huge win. And I come back to market shaping. One of the things that I know in this government does have some resonance is the notion of market gaps, shaping markets, and using really creative funding mechanisms to get in there. I would go and really stress on that message, on the durability, on the leverage, and on the effectiveness, because I think that they were true, they are true, and as you all are going into the replenishment, those will be, I think, very valuable messages. So thank you. Remember the discounting, and it's a pleasure to see you all.
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here today with people who are involved in the advanced market commitment originally, and the pneumococcus advanced market commitment originally. So Alice Albright, who just opened this up, was heard was a co-chair of the Center for Global Development panel with Ruth and me that I like to think was instrumental in the idea of the advanced market commitment. And Amie Batson, who's going to close the panel, was actually involved in the original inception of the advanced market commitment idea back when she was at the bank. And I think it's really an opportune time. I hadn't realized it was a 10-year anniversary of an article of mine, but I don't like to think I'm that old. But I do think it's an opportune time to think about what the experience has been so far with the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus and what the agenda might be going forward. So let me say a little bit about the Center for Global Development report on advanced market commitments, or on pull mechanisms. And what that report called for was a commitment by donors to help finance the purchase of vaccines that when they were developed, so this was to cover vaccines that weren't already in existence, and the idea of this commitment in advance to help finance the purchase was twofold. First, it was to help encourage the development of new vaccines that were needed for the developing world, that perhaps had a somewhat different profile than what was needed for the developed world. So you could think, for example, of a malaria vaccine, where there might be some developed world demand, but it's really needed for the developing world. But as I'll explain later, pneumococcus is another case I'll explain why that's relevant in a minute. But the second goal was to ensure access to vaccines once they're developed, because often, historically, there'd really been a 10-year gap or more between the development of new vaccines and their introduction and widespread use in the poorest countries of the world. They would typically get rolled out first in the United States, then make it to Europe, maybe middle-income countries, but it would take a very long time before they got to the poorest countries of the world. And that's actually where most of the deaths are taking place. Okay. So the idea of this advanced market commitment was, in some ways, this was based on the insight, that in the R&D system for rich world diseases involves two elements. It involves a push element, with the government putting in lots of upfront resources into the cost of R&D through things like the NIH in the U.S. or analogs in other countries. It also involves a pull from the prospect of a market. And that gives incentives for pharmaceutical companies to sometimes to do basic R&D, but more often to take the things that have come perhaps from the NIHs of the world and to work on translating what's a great concept into an actual product. And that involves all sorts of work, and conceptual work, but also a lot of very detailed, very boring, but very essential work to actually come up with something that can go in kids' arms in the case of a vaccine or mouse. And it's really the combination of, there are tons of problems with the U.S. system of financing R&D on health. But for all its problems, it's regularly producing products. I guess there's questions now, is it regularly enough? But we've gotten huge gains in health from the technological advances from that system. In the case of the developing world, for diseases that are specific to the developing world, there was really, if you go back a bit further in history, there was really very little of either the push or the pull. We've made a lot of progress, not to say that we don't need more on the push side, the Gates Foundation with the greater global interest in public health, but the pull side was still lagging behind. So the idea of the advanced market commitment was to try and supply that missing pull, and to do it in a way that would both both incentivize R&D and then help ensure that once the products were developed, they reach the people who need them. So we recommended, in our group, we recommended going forward with this idea. We spent a lot of time trying to think about how could you make it practical, how could you make it workable. And we recommended going forward on two fronts. So first, something that was a major technological challenge, something like a malaria vaccine. Okay? And that offers the opportunity to get both of these benefits, both the technological advancement and getting the product out. But we also recommended going with something that was an easier target, where there was a little bit more R&D work to do, but it was much easier to see how you were, to think that you were going to get there quickly. And that was in part, we wanted to move on both fronts, and that second front, in part, because there are some very important diseases like that, and pneumococcus, as I'll explain, is certainly a case like that. But in part, just to make sure that at a very simple procedural level, this concept would work. Because the concept of an advanced market commitment is that the donors are going to make some promise to help finance the purchase of these vaccines. Well, and then the companies have to make a commitment. They have to build factories, they have to do R&D or build factories, and those are very expensive propositions, and reliance on that. Well, would they do that? Could you write these long-term contracts? It was an open question. So the donors then, I hope influenced by the report, thought about this. They decided they wanted to move initially with this short-run target. And that's what was the origin of the pilot, and that's why the word pilot is in there, advanced market commitment for pneumococcus. So let me say a little bit about pneumococcus for people who aren't familiar with it. Pneumococcus is a disease that, doesn't get a lot of publicity. It must be one of the ones with the highest ratios of deaths to publicity out there. It kills 1.6 million people every year, including up to 1 million children. So it actually accounts for 1 in 4 child deaths. It's a huge, huge killer. Okay? Now, there's been a childhood vaccine for strains of the disease that are common in the West for some time. This was sold for something, in the U.S. it's sold for something like $70 a dose. Okay? So why is this an appropriate target? Well, it's an appropriate target. First of all, that $70 dose vaccine was not getting to people in developing countries. The $70 a dose when you need 3 doses, that's enough of an obstacle right there. But there was another issue, which is there's somewhat different strains of the disease in different environments, and there's some strains that are common in the developing world that were not common in the developed world. So what did the advanced market commitment do? Well, it committed $1.5 billion, and let me recognize the countries. The Italians made the biggest contribution, the UK, Canada, Norway, Russia, this in part because this was done at a G8 summit in Russia, Gates Foundation, and then this was channeled through the World Bank. And tell me if I've forgotten somebody. So under the advanced market commitment, the firms that are entering into what's called a supply commitment, a commitment to supply the vaccine, first they have to develop a product that meets some specifications. So this has to include the strains that are common in developing countries. There's a bunch of other technical specifications to make sure it's an adequate, technically adequate vaccine. They also have to commit to a long-term price to make the supply available at no more than a certain price, and that price was $3.50. So as you can imagine, as you can see, that's a huge cut from the levels in the rich countries. In exchange, what they get is for the first, I believe it's 20% of doses, they get a top-up price through this advanced market commitment. And that top-up price basically doubles, it's roughly doubling that $3.50. Okay, so the average price over the contract period works out to just under $5 per dose. I was involved in some of there were a lot of different committees and I was involved in some of the advisory committees for this, and in addition to being involved in the Center for Global Development Group. There's a lot of discussion about exactly how to structure this, and I'll say something about that, and what price is appropriate. And there was a lot of tension about this offer is out there. How are the firms going to react? We were sort of crossing our fingers and biting our nails, and I don't know if you can do those simultaneously, but anyway. Recently the firms, in fact, have developed, two firms have developed the vaccines that qualify and have accepted the deal and committed to supply vaccines, and vaccines are now reaching kids. So that is, in terms of, we're really thrilled about this. So the overall level, I think this is a huge success. I'll delve into the details in a minute, but these are diseases that kill 1.6 million people a year. We now have a vaccine that's getting out to people. So huge, I think, a huge accomplishment. What are some of the issues that have come up? Well, one issue let me talk about two. Just looking back, and I'll say some other things looking forward. One issue is price, and that's got a lot of attention. So there's a group of people who feel like could have got away with less than the price that was charged and should have offered less, and the companies, in their view, the companies still would have taken that deal. Another issue that I'd like to raise is the quantity issue. Okay, so my own take on this is that the price issue it's a difficult problem, and I saw some of that when I was on the committee. I can't go into details on everything I saw on the committee, but there were a group of experts who were charged with doing this. I'm not even going to say I necessarily agreed with every detail. The group came to some decision, but we saw estimates of what the cost might be, and we saw lots of estimates of costs. And I think I think there are a couple of things that are important to remember when thinking about what's the appropriate price setting. So the first thing is, I think we have to take a realistic view of pharmaceutical company incentives. I don't think we can necessarily assume that if you could somehow find out, and certainly nobody on the committee knew this for sure, what the exact cost of production was. But I don't think we can assume that if we knew that price and we offered that price, the companies would have said yes. Let me say a couple reasons. First, these companies are charging $70 a dose in the U.S. That's a very big financial, that's where their real money is coming from. They don't want to jeopardize that price. Jeopardizing that price is very costly to them. Put yourself in the shoes of one of these companies. They said they were very concerned about that they would build a factory and the demand wouldn't be there. Okay, I think they were partly worried about the cost of building the factory, which are enormous. I think there's another issue that they weren't talking about, and this is conjecture based on my being an economics professor, not based on anything I heard from the companies. If they wound up with excess capacity, they would politically come under very intense pressure, I think, for their pricing, first in middle-income countries and potentially in rich countries. Taking even a small risk of coming under political pressure for their pricing in rich countries is enormously costly. So I think it's not obvious that they would take this deal. Okay? The other issue is thinking about this from GAVI's perspective, or from the global health perspective. The price that's being paid for this, the long-term price is $3.50, the average price $5. At that price, these are enormously effective investments. The cost per year of life saved is something like $100. Okay, what do we pay for cost per year of life saved in the rich world? $50,000, $100,000. You can save a lot of lives with a limited amount of money. Even within the global health arena, there are a lot of things where the evidence just isn't, it's not clear. It's not clear what value for money we're getting. Getting a vaccine with this proven efficacy at $5 a dose average price is a terrific deal. If you try to say, well, we're going to try and, maybe we won't offer $3.50, maybe we can get it for $3. Well, if it goes right, you save 50 cents per dose. If it goes wrong, there's 1.6 million people who are dying of pneumococcus each year. There's a asymmetric loss function. So I don't know what the right decision is on price. In some ways, I don't think we'll ever have a totally definitive answer because we won't know what the companies would have done if they'd been offered another price. But I think it was and I do think it was a reasonable. I can see how this was a reasonable decision for the people who ultimately made the decision under the circumstances. Okay, let me say an area where I do think perhaps another decision would have been appropriate, and that was on the quantity. Okay, so one of the maybe it's worth bringing up the slide right now. I think in part because of concerns about, was this a lot of money going to particular companies? The GAVI made a decision to only call for a limited amount of commitment. They sort of held some of their their fire. So here are the projections of vaccine demand. These are projections. Who knows whether they'll be right? This is from the GAVI GAVI website, so I'm assuming it's up to date. But this is the amount of capacity that's committed. They only called for this much capacity. Now, I think if you can see, this is 2013. You're going to start, here's 2012. You're going to start having, according to these projections, you're going to start having shortages pretty soon. Now, in fact, GAVI has some ability to affect the speed at which countries take this up. They can go work with countries and try and get them to take it up. Given this is such a highly cost-effective vaccine, I think it would have made more sense to ask for a greater commitment, a greater supply commitment. And then it takes time to build a factory. So if you don't install the capacity now, you're not going to be able to have it for a while. I think this was motivated in part by, well, we don't want to give too much of the contract to particular firms. Well, to me, I think the health objective is more important. Look, some other firms may later develop vaccines. I don't think they're going to have them soon enough. Maybe there's contrary information to that. And I think you could have said we're going to offer $100 million doses of contract initially. I think the long-term supply issue, the mechanism itself, there's concern if you rely on a few companies, you won't have long-term supply. But the contract itself builds in a commitment to long-run supply. Other producers, I wouldn't argue, labor costs are not a big share of the cost of producing vaccines. So it'd be nice to have an Indian producer there, but it's not like their costs are necessarily going to be that much lower in my view. Okay. What are the so I think that's perhaps something that could have been done differently. What are the lessons? Well, first the private AMC worked procedurally. The firms supplied, the contracts got written. We can get vaccines to kids. Second, the new vaccines got out much faster. The new vaccines, these vaccines that covered the strains in the developing world got out to the developing world very, very quickly. That's historically unusual, and that's going to save a lot of lives. I've seen estimates as big as 7 million lives. I haven't gone over those numbers myself. Third lesson is that we need to assure capacity. And there were some technical things that some of these committees, I was on recommended revisions to the working group to allow greater capacity. But the other thing you have to do is make a big enough order. So one of the things this mechanism can do is allow you to go out and roll this out quickly. You might as well take full advantage of it. Okay. The issue of the price, so I'm not going to say that the wrong decision was made on the price, but I do think we learned something about when you're dealing with a near-term product, it's going to be politically contentious because there's specific, if it's a near-term product, then there's some firm that's close, or maybe a couple of firms that are close. That means that if you offer a slightly higher price, people are going to say, well, you're favoring those companies. I think there's advantage, before I thought there were big economic advantages. I would still stick with the conclusion of the original Center for Global Development report. You want to do the near-term products because you want to get them out there, but I think there's also a case for early-term products, both to spur the basic R&D that's needed, to get it out when it's out, but I would add a political advantage, which is from a sort of technical economics point of view, if you offer a higher price, the rents will be competed away. It's not that you're giving rents to a particular firm. There's more firms that can enter the market, or firms that are already in the race can intensify their efforts. And so you won't be giving, if firms react rationally to this, it's not that there's a particular identifiable firm which is going to get this. It's going to be a competition. More firms will spend resources entering that competition. And I think that's not only economically attractive, but it's also politically attractive. It's as I think it's therefore worth looking, in addition to the pneumococcus AMC, to think about what are some more distant targets. And that's a big technical decision. Should that be malaria? Should that be TB? Should it be something else? I'm not going to try and answer that question. It's also worth thinking about other areas for advanced market commitments. And in that regard, I think it's worth noting that the Canadians, who are a key player in the vaccine advanced market commitment, are now launching a scoping process to think about an agriculture advanced market commitment for products that are needed for the developing world. And there, I think it would really make sense to think not only about a short-run target, but also about a technologically more distant target. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much to Alice and Michael for your comments. I think in a very short period of time, we've been able to capture the great breadth of the issues in this space. So as we transition to thinking about the future, I'd like us to take a look at GAVI's current sources of funding. This allocates IFM, AMC, and direct to all of the contributors over the past decade. And as you can see, it's a very European picture. And, of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Those are the big contributors here. Yet, herd community from vaccine-preventable disease is a global public good. This was one of the motivations behind the creation of GAVI in the first place and the Global Fund. And yet, the financing structure of GAVI doesn't reflect that all countries in the world do benefit from having certain levels of herd immunity for vaccines. There's no global tax system that a world government implements that would be, the rational way to raise money for something like GAVI. So we have to think of other ways to manage this. And I guess ideally we'd like to see countries above a certain wealth threshold contribute according to the benefits that they receive from herd immunity and the elimination of vaccine-preventable disease. And I'm working on this as part of a future global commitment to vaccination index. But in the meantime, I've carried out a very rough exercise that tries to look at fair share contribution to GAVI based on a country's wealth. So let's look at the current donors in terms of how well they did at contributing their fair share. So this chart is just subtracting a country's current GAVI contribution share from their share of global GDP. So at the top of the chart, we can see that the UK represents about 5% of global GDP, but 36% of GAVI funding over the past decade. They're contributing much more than their fair share. This is just the difference. So on the positive side, you can see that they're performing above where they would be expected given their level of global GDP. And at the bottom of the chart, my own country, the United States, where we're contributing about 28% of global GDP, but only 5% of GAVI financing. And the people and the countries in the middle are contributing about what would be expected given their share of global wealth. What if we asked G20 members to contribute their fair share to GAVI? What would GAVI funding look like? And think back to the first graph that I showed you at the beginning. So the US and Europe are still major contributors, more than half together. And I've put all of the European countries that are members of the EC together with the EC in this slide just so that you can sort of take out the purple and the red and then look at the other contributors. But what we can see is that China, India, Brazil, these are all countries that could be able to contribute to GAVI because they will perceive benefits and they do have theoretically the capacity to contribute. Of course, this is not net benefits, so we'll get to that later, but I just thought I'd put that out there as one possible argument to make when we think about U.S. funding for GAVI and also the role of health and global public goods on the G20 agenda. Thank you. So now let's switch to our friends from the GAVI Alliance. We'll start with Dr. Helen Evans and then David Ferreira. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And first of all, I'd really like to thank the CGD for its strong technical and analytical leadership and convening power over the last 10 years. It's been a fantastic friend and supporter to GAVI, and many of the people in the room have contributed to that, addressing some of the obstacles to immunisation and lack of predictable financing. So thank you very much. The work that you did, and you've heard a bit about today, of course, led to the development of our two landmark innovative financing mechanisms, the IFM, and AMC, which you've just heard about. And I understand the topic that I've been asked to talk about today is looking forward, GAVI's challenges. And in 10 minutes, that's quite a challenge in itself, I should say. But I'm delighted to be here, so thank you. Let me start by framing that question in the context of our new GAVI strategy. That's the GAVI Strategy 2011 to 2015. And then I'm going to pick a few key elements of that to talk about the challenges. As I imagine most people in this room know, that GAVI is a public-private partnership and a financing instrument. We're not an implementing agency. And the GAVI board is truly multi-stakeholder. You can see that. I won't go into detail because I think most of you probably know, but it is very much a public-private partnership. And for me, this is both its strength and a source of inspiration and innovation, but it's also a challenge. A 28-member board is not always easy, but I think it's worth the challenge. But if we're talking about challenges, the board is, the public-private partnership is, as I said, both a strength and a challenge as well. So let me just move now to the new GAVI strategy. Starting in late 2009 and through the first part of 2010, there was a lengthy consultation on the new GAVI strategy that would take us forward for the next 5 years. Critical years. There were clear instructions from the board that the strategy should be aspirational. We asked, and the board members said, no, we don't want you to limit it in the context of the current economic environment. We need to deal with that through the business planning process and, if necessary, prioritisation. But we want this strategy to be aspirational, taking us forward. And they also said that the strategy that was current at the time, the 2007 to 2010 strategy, was pretty okay. So what they were looking at was some fine-tuning. And we also drew on the emerging themes from what's called the GAVI 2 evaluation that was underway at the same time. And so these are the 4 strategic goals that the board endorsed in the middle of last year. You can see there's the accelerate the uptake of vaccines, the contribution to strengthening the capacity of integrated health systems, and the increased predictability and sustainability. These are not very different to the goals that were already in place. Although what is different moving forward, and this was a very clear message we got from the evaluation, was that this new strategy moving forward also includes specific strategic objectives and performance indicators so we can measure ourselves, and a measurement process that we keep reporting on. And also we've done some strong policy development over the last few years that will also underpin the implementation of this strategy. But it's strategic goal 4, that's the new goal, and it's about market shaping. We've always, as you've heard from both Alice and Michael, we've always had an approach based on the belief that a key component to sustainable development is to change the way the markets work. And in our case, that's the vaccine market. And actually, GAVI's basic business model is about market shaping. It's led to vaccine developers and manufacturers paying more attention to the developing world market. Because frankly, before, very few manufacturers saw any real opportunities, and therefore it was quite a fractured market and an uncertain market. As Michael said, it was one that was not, the products were not necessarily targeted to be the most effective in developing countries. And by definition, it was one without any serious purchasing capacity. So I think that what GAVI's done is changed both sides of the market equation. On the one hand, thanks in large part to IFM and AMC, we've secured a significant level of donor funds, and so we represent a serious purchasing power. And on the demand side, we aggregated developing country demand by bringing together half or more of the annual birth cohort. So that's a pretty big volume. So we have supported the development of new markets through accumulation and aggregation, and that's a basic feature of the GAVI model. However, we now need to be clearer and I think cleverer about where the levers lie in market shaping. What are the drivers of cost? Where does GAVI have relative market power? What is it more targeted that can shape markets? And that was one of the reasons why the board decided very clearly that we should have a clear strategy. Just to talk about some of the levers, just some examples. We know, for example, that the pentavalent market, GAVI has significant market power and represents a large proportion of market volume and value. These figures are quite approximate, but it may be as much as 75%. So we've got a lot of leverage there. However, we know that the pneumococcal market, we've got less market power. But we have a success through the AMC, so the AMC has allowed us to lever. For rotavirus, that's still an emerging market, but we've got moderate market power. So the new GAVI strategy moves us from more of what I think we would describe as market watching stance to an active market shaping, and it elevates market shaping to a strategic goal with two clear objectives. And the objectives in the new strategy are, first, to ensure adequate supply to meet demand through diverse supplier base, providing products that meet country needs. That's one that can be discussed. And second, to minimise cost of vaccines to GAVI and countries. We currently have a board task team that's being chaired by USAID that's in the final stages of developing a new strategy for supply and procurement for 2011 to 2015, and that will go to the July board meeting. And that's going to be a big focus and a challenge for us moving forward. Let me just touch briefly on the AMC, and I don't want to cover too many of the things that Michael's covered. And this is clearly somewhere where we've been market shaping. I think that the signing of long-term binding commitments to supply a fixed amount of vaccines per year at a predetermined price is really unprecedented. It's a huge shift. And despite our detractors, I think the price of $3.50 can be considered a significant achievement, as it represents nearly a 90% price drop. And it's allowed the vaccine to be available very promptly. In fact, the newly crafted vaccine that's targeted to developing markets, the PCV 10 and 13, is actually reaching developing countries within the 12 months, same 12 months it's reaching here in the US, for instance. And having been now at a number of the launches, Nicaragua and Kenya most recently, it's just extraordinarily rewarding, I have to say, and quite humbling to see the enormous enthusiasm of parents, largely mothers, I have to say, coming forward to have their children vaccinated. It's a huge achievement, I think. The AMC's also given us huge advocacy power. It's because of the innovative design of the AMC that's received so much attention that's led to increased awareness and attention to pneumococcal disease, to the power of vaccines, and to GAVI's role. And I don't think we can underestimate the advocacy role, all of which is extremely helpful at a time of shrinking ODA budgets. And we really need to scale up so we can deliver the promise of these vaccines. Just let me talk then briefly about Strategic Goal 3, which is about increased predictability and improved sustainability. David's going to talk, the predictability part is around global financing, and I'm going to leave the innovative financing part to David, who can speak much more eloquently on it than I can. But I want to comment briefly on the sustainability aspects of the goal, which relate to national level financing. Co-financing of new vaccines has been a policy of GAVI for a long time, but last year the board approved a revised co-financing policy. Previously, it had been a small amount that they co-financed, and it was more about country commitment than it was about moving countries to sustainable financing. We now have a policy that's three-tiered, and for those countries that are what are called graduating from GAVI in 2015, they're going to be on a trajectory of co-financing that should get them at a point when they stop being eligible for GAVI funding that they have on their own books funding for it. But, and it's interesting talking in the context of our resource mobilisation need, I think sustainability is a lot more than just about co-financing for the vaccines. There's a clear message that we're getting from donors as we head towards the GAVI Pledging Conference, which I'll talk about, that it's more than just a demonstration of country ownership. It's more about country ownership of health as a development driver and vaccines as being a key investment in it. And this is what donors certainly are wanting to see more of, and as importantly, countries are wanting to see more of it themselves. And this movement will take us beyond ministries of health, which has been currently where GAVI has largely focused, definitely into ministries of finance, treasuries, and to political levels. So it's actually moving us up and out a whole dimension. So what can we deliver in what people would call perhaps GAVI Phase 3? With the new vaccines incorporated into GAVI's program, we estimate that an additional 4 million future deaths can be prevented by 2015. And WHO advises us that in the first decade, GAVI supports help to immunise an additional 280 million children and prevented over 5 million future deaths. So we have the vaccines to prevent many of the major child killer diseases, including the major causes of pneumonia and severe diarrhoea. Perhaps I could have the next slide. You can see there, that's pretty compelling, the causes of child deaths in low-income countries. You can see pneumonia and diarrhoea take up 36% of child deaths under 5. So this is a huge opportunity. We can almost double the rate of GAVI lives saved in the last 10 years in the next 5 years. But we do need to see donors and countries step up their contribution and vaccine prices to fall. My Norwegian colleagues call this the three-legged stool. So it's about donor money, it's about lowering prices, and it's about countries' contribution. And I think those are our big challenges moving forward. Before I finish and hand over to David, I guess it's always nice to have a slide from our sponsors, and you've seen you've seen the huge contribution that the UK have made to date, and with a change in government, a change to a Conservative government that has a slash and burn for domestic funding, I think it's enormously to their credit that they have retained their commitment to ODA. They did a very large multilateral review of their 43 internationally funded organisations. In the words of the Secretary of State for Development, Andrew Mitchell, he said, "We took a long, hard look at the value for money offered by 43 international funds and organisations through which the UK spends its aid and considered how effective each organisation was at tackling poverty." And this graph, which we take from their report, plots those organisations against their organisational strength on the vertical axis and their contribution to development objectives on the horizontal axis. And 9 organisations, represented by the green diamonds on the top right-hand side, were assessed as being very good value. Needless to say, it was incredibly heartening to us to see where GAVI sat. This is a comment on the huge contribution of individuals and agencies over the last 10 years, including many of you who are in this room today. So I think this is an enormous collective achievement. So we have a pledging meeting in June, as Amanda flagged. The opportunity for new commitments will be there at that June the 13th meeting that the UK government is hosting. It's attracting a lot of attention, a lot of hard work. I don't think we've ever been in the spotlight, and I defer to others who have much longer history of GAVI. I don't think we've been in the spotlight at such a high political level before. Prime Minister Cameron is going to open it. Prime Minister Stoltenberg is going to be there. Bill Gates is going to be there. Raj Shah is going to be there, we hope, yes. President Sarkozy, maybe. So we're on a roll. The aid landscape's changed. The fulcrum of economic power is shifting. I think that we need to focus more on emerging economies. I was very interested in the slides that you showed, Amanda. As they're key players, the emerging economies, both financially and also in terms of vaccine production. But I think there's a hugely positive momentum. It's very exciting, and it's also challenging. And as I just finish with the sort of three-legged stool, donor money, vaccine prices, and country contribution. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to David to talk about the innovative financing part of it.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Amanda and CGD, for inviting us here. You guys are great friends of GAVI, and it's always very rewarding to work with you in more ways than one. So thanks very much. And Alison, Michael, and Amie, great to be on a panel with you. So I'm going to speak about the GAVI Innovative Finance agenda going forward. Helen mentioned the three-legged stool a couple of times, and certainly when it comes to country co-financing and sustainability, and when it comes to vaccine prices and market shaping, that's part of the GAVI Innovative Finance landscape. But Helen also said we have a pledging meeting coming up in June, and so it's really all hands on deck, including all innovative finance hands on deck, to look at the third leg for the moment, which is around resource mobilization and donor funding. And also Amanda's only given me a few minutes, so that's what I'll focus on. So just to say, the headline is that our aim is to expand the portfolio and to continually develop a portfolio of funding sources that is, first of all, diversified in terms of the source that the funding comes from, public, private, etc., in terms of the duration, long-term, short-term, and in terms of the volatility. So some more predictable, some more volatile, but both upwards and downwards. And then secondly, a portfolio that enables us, by design, to meet donors' needs, whether they be public or private. They have different needs financially, fiscally, and politically, and so forth. And so to engineer around those and to be able to offer a suite of product that meets them. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense, these are therefore, from an innovative finance perspective, the 5 principal work streams that we're engaged in right at the moment. And you can go straight on to the next slide, please. So Alice spoke about IFM, and I think made a lot of pertinent observations. And Amanda, if we have a few minutes at the end, I can perhaps reflect back on some of those. I think it's a good discussion to have. But in a nutshell, I mean, IFM has worked. And so it's a vehicle that, as Alice previews, we want to maintain as a permanent plank as part of the GAVI funding portfolio going forward. And there are many reasons for that, some of which we've flashed up here on the board. But the principal one is probably the sheer visibility of funding and the flexibility of that funding, both of which are very important in our business for some of the reasons that Michael touched on during his talk. There has been a very recent independent evaluation of IFM, and the results are in the process of coming in. But I can tell you, sort of in the second line of the executive summary, this little quotation appears, which is, IFM has worked, it's been cost effective to deliver what it promised, and the case for donors to put further money into it, this is an evaluation that was commissioned by donors, is strong. Next slide, please. The next work stream that I wanted to talk about is our approach to the private sector. So we believe that the private sector has got the potential to be a significant contributor to GAVI's finances. Will never dominate GAVI's finances, but certainly can contribute significantly more than the 0.something% that it currently does. This does require us to allocate time and resources to that funding stream. So we need to make resource allocation decisions, but we believe that it is worth it, not only because it reduces dependency on government donors and spreads the portfolio from that perspective, but also because it enables us to spread the word. It's a virtuous cycle by which we obtain more and more investors in, as it were, people who literally buy into the GAVI mission and understand the power of immunization. And so I think, consumer citizens, the more that they're engaged in what we do and support what we do, the easier they make that for politicians to vote money to us and so forth. Certainly, historically, as you alluded to, Amanda, we have developed a private philanthropy approach. I think going forward, what we're now looking to layer onto that is an approach which uses one of the principal assets that we have, which is very high-level political commitment and the sovereign money that comes along with that to leverage in private capital. And I think that's a new direction in our thinking, and there's some exciting developments on that front. So next slide. This is a project that we have recently announced with the UK government and which we're about to launch into the market. It's a very simple product which we call 1+1+1 because there are 3 actors involved. It's the government, it's a company, and it is a consumer citizen. And if you go straight on to the next slide, the mechanics are very straightforward. If I'm the UK government and you are, Vodafone, I will say to you, look, if you undertake to contribute £5 million to GAVI over the next 5 years, the UK government will match that pound for pound. But by the way, part of the deal I'd like to do with you is that you also go out with a marketing campaign to your consumers and to your employees, for that matter, and tell them about immunization, tell them about GAVI, and look to garner money from them. And every pound that you take from them, the government will also match up to some sort of cap. The UK government has endorsed this and allocated £50 million to the project for us to get it off the ground, and we are now in the process of going out to the market with the product in collaboration with the UK government. Our ambassador in the UK for these discussions with corporates is the current chair of the board of IFM, Alan Gillespie. Next slide, please. This is just to give you a sense of a work stream that is deliberately on the back burner until post-June the 13th, but one that we'd be delighted to engage you folks in. I won't say much about it except that it's conceptually very similar actually to what the Global Fund has recently been doing with Dow Jones, with Deutsche Bank, which is looking at the impact investing, or more accurately, socially responsible investing market, and seeing whether there is a way to effectively bootstrap endowment type revenue as part of the funding stream. And so this is we're looking at a similar market with a slightly different approach, and as I say, delighted to work with you on that starting on June the 14th. Next slide, please. The next theme I wanted to talk about, this is the next work stream, is leveraging donor balance sheets. Helen and I were talking about this in the cab coming over. In our world, there is as in everybody's world, I suppose, you always want to look to make cash that is not working hard enough work harder. And so we are working currently with one of our donors in a project that was approved by our Audit and Finance Committee recently. And it's conceptually very simple, again, which is, we sit on very large cash reserves. This is not an actual number, but it's not far from the truth. Let's say $1 billion. And the idea is very, very simple. Certainly in the corporate world it would be simple, which is take that cash reserve down by, in this example, $300 million, use the cash to buy vaccines, but still have the security that the cash buffer is supposed to give you against future operating expenses, because you replace the cash with a line of credit, with a credit facility, which in this case would be supplied by a commercial bank, but it would be guaranteed by one of our donors. So it's leveraging the donor balance sheet and using, and freeing up cash that we can use now for vaccination. And this is a theme that we're looking at in various parts of our business. Then finally, to round out the suite, we just did want to say that when it comes to, if you go back to my diversification point at the beginning, diversification of the portfolio, part of that diversification is designing to donors' needs, and our donors are principally sovereign. And so we need to look, other than the kind of vanilla multilateral contributions that donors have historically made to us, we have to look at all kinds of creative ways of accessing other pots of monies that sovereign donors have available. And so our executive committee has authorized a pilot on accepting a certain limited amount of bilateral aid from donors on the condition that it doesn't conflict with our essential multilateral business model, and that we don't end up with neglecting beneficiaries and recipients just because, as it were, they don't have a bilateral godmother or godfather. So that's a pilot that we are now in the process of rolling out, and we'll monitor that over the next year or so. And then I did want to flash up here that when it comes to money that is in areas like IDA, International Development Association, the concessional finance arm of the World Bank, which has announced in its last replenishment a very big commitment to immunization. The question is, can we help them to find ways to access those funds? And I think we'll have a productive relationship with the World Bank and others around that. The World Bank also, administers a specific trust fund that many of you are aware of, which is around results-based financing, and which is several hundreds of millions of dollars, which largely come from the UK and Norway. And can we offer a product that will appeal to that trust fund, etc. So I think again, this is an idea that we have on a slow boil at the moment. We'd love to see, as you know, Amanda, whether it's the type of thing we can work with you folks on. And then finally, to round out the work streams, just to let you know that when it comes to things like the leading group on innovative financing for development, the stuff that happens in the UN, the G20 and so forth, when those folks talk about innovative finance, sometimes it is the kind of stuff we've been talking about here, but very often it's actually about raising incremental fiscal revenues. It's about raising, in effect, new taxes or levies to fund development from outside the official development assistance or ODA budget. Now, that's not much that as an institution or an organization, GAVI can do that much about. But we do want to make sure that we encourage those initiatives and that we remain on the radar screen and that global health remains on the radar screen. So we try to allocate the appropriate amount of resource to this. Alice will be familiar with the challenge of doing that. And we try and do it in a way, hopefully, that is sensible and strategic. But I think very significantly, we try to do that with partners in the global health space. And in November in Tokyo, I agreed with a number of colleagues in agencies such as the WHO, USAID, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, the Global Fund, that we would form under the Secretariat auspices of the French government a health sector task force within the leading group on innovative finance for development. And the objective there is, make sure that when it comes to the G20 and other fora, that global health has its place in the sun in relation to all the currency transaction levies, the tobacco transaction tax proposal, and so on. And that clearly, from our perspective, within that, GAVI is recognized as one of the players there. So that's really it from my side, Amanda. I wondered if you want me to sit down now, or it would be quite useful at some point to reflect on Alice's comments, but should I do that later? You guide me. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay, we're going to end with a comment from Amie, and then we'll open it up for your comments and questions, and we'll also give the panelists a chance to respond to what they've heard.
So, it's very exciting to be here talking about GAVI, especially now that Amanda's taken off the slide that shows the U.S. way over here in the wrong side of the equation. But I would say that the U.S. is incredibly committed to immunization and to GAVI. We see the future of immunization and vaccines as really part of the big game changers that are going to allow us to achieve the sort of child mortality goals that we've espoused, as well as even with some of the vaccines, some of the other areas, some of the other goals, and potentially malaria and TB, HIV/AIDS someday. So we're incredibly focused on and enthusiastic about the work that can be done on immunization and that GAVI is doing. I was reflecting as the various presentations were going on about why are donors like the U.S. So committed? What is it that we, the donors, are saying to each other? What is it when I go up and have to talk to Hill staffers or others that we're saying is our compelling case? And I guess there's a couple key things. One is, it is the compelling story. This is about saving children's lives. And there's just nothing better than that. And every single parent in the room kind of immediately understands the value of that. And the powerful advocacy around that compelling story stands alone. But beyond just that story, it's also this value for money. Helen was mentioning sort of having already saved 5 million lives in the short span that GAVI has been here, the potential going forward with Rota and Pneumo and Meninge and the existing set of vaccines where I think the last estimate I heard was 7 million lives over the next 10 years, is just extraordinary. And there are very few interventions that you can invest in and get that kind of return. It is also, though, the strategic approach that's being brought to this particular domain. It's not just, okay, we get a product, we're going to get it out. It's actually shaping that product. It's this issue of how can we help drive the research and development and accelerate it and make sure it's resulting in the kind of products that can immediately be used in developing country situations? How are we helping to ensure that there is the capacity and the affordable pricing and the evidence base to allow us to accelerate access? How can we shorten that period of time from when a vaccine becomes available in the U.S. and when it becomes available in a developing country? And there's just been an enormous amount of work and a lot of innovative financing that you've seen that is focused on really addressing those challenges and in a hugely successful way, which is very exciting. It's looking at the kind of delivery systems in the countries and thinking creatively about how do we improve the access and the scale up in countries. And then you see something like the introduction, like the UK analysis, which every single government in the world looks at. And even if our own governments aren't in a position to do this kind of analysis, is hugely, hugely compelling when you see that kind of graphic. And it does really speak to the kind of work that GAVI is doing, but perhaps even more to the partnership who have helped this happen. All of the innovations that were talked about this morning, the original spark for those didn't happen inside a GAVI secretariat. They happened inside the GAVI community, with the partners identifying these things and saying, let's bring this to vaccines, let's bring this into GAVI, now let's work as a community and make this happen. And that is the power. You see in GAVI, and you saw in Amanda's slides, there is a hardcore base, a really loyal base to GAVI, who are exceptionally important. I mean, you have the UK and Norway and Gates Foundation and France and Italy and the US too, even if we look small on the way she did her chart, who are really the loyal base. And that's important. But what's even more important is this sort of diversification, the number of new partners that are expressing interest in joining GAVI. So Japan and Korea and China and Brazil and Russia, and South Africa, who are all really interested in how can they become contributing members to this larger global effort. But it's not also only the donors. I mean, the donors are helping to provide funding, which is clearly the fuel. But it's this stakeholder base. And as Helen mentioned, it's a mixed blessing. Having a lot of stakeholders who have different agendas, who have, their definition of what are we trying to achieve isn't always the same. But it's that difference in perspective that makes this effort more robust. And lets us really kind of learn and have to push and prod each other into getting to a better space. I think what's changed a little bit, there's a couple of different things that have been added onto the list. The compelling story, the value for money, the strategic approach, the excitement around that, the innovative financing, which has shown that $1 can be worth more than $1 if it brings extra benefits to it. But there's also a couple other areas now that donors are increasingly focusing on and partners are focusing on. So it is this issue of country accountability, which is measured in results. Are the countries using those funds that are provided to them to best effect? And are the countries putting up some of their own money to show that they really own and are driving forward this agenda? It's about the integrity of the funds and the sort of systems that help ensure that the funds are used for their intended purpose. And ensuring that, an organization like GAVI is completely on top of that and is very much driving forward to ensure that, if there is a breach in how funds are used, immediately knowing it and being able to build the system to capture it and then strengthen capacity and ensure that the funds are used for the intended purposes. And that's exceptionally important right now when you have a lot of governments struggling to make sure that they have funds to invest in programs like this. They want to know that every dollar is going where it's supposed to go. The last area I would highlight as being sort of the critical thing, and it links a little bit back to some of this innovative financing, but it's that creativity. You clearly heard from David, the creativity never stops, and so lots of kind of potential ideas, and I'm delighted to see the results-based financing being tagged. I think looking at how can GAVI and how can the immunization community harness the incredible level of expertise, of thinking that doesn't just exist amongst, the hardcore immunization donors or even the immunization community, but that exists overall in a number of different sectors, from, the engineers who were the basis for the cold chain, to some of the scientists who are driving research, to, the students that we have now at various universities who are coming up with these incredibly creative adaptations of existing technologies to improve how we can do business in a variety of areas. So it's that sort of harnessing the creativity around vaccines, around the whole immunization system, around the information flows, and how do you use, mHealth and telehealth to really kind of capture the ability to have information flowing much, much more effectively. And how do you build that health system strengthening, which is, kind of the toughest part of all of our jobs? How do you make sure that underlying base is there, but in a way that is delivering real results? And hence why sort of that link to something like results-based financing, which is how do you make the chain of events arrive at a child being immunized, or a woman delivering in a facility, or someone sleeping under a bed net, whatever the metric may be. How do you make sure that whole chain of health system events gets there? And donors are really looking at that. And there's a recognition that GAVI can't drive health systems. You can't drive a health system around immunization. The Global Fund can't drive health systems just around AIDS, malaria, or TB. It's this issue of fitting into the larger community and recognizing where's the niche, where's the comparative advantage, and then how does it go forward. So with that, I would just close. I think the replenishment that's coming up in June, there's a tremendous amount of excitement. The community has really rallied around. As Helen has said, it's gotten huge amounts of political commitment that have not been seen, I think, in the past with GAVI. There's always been a political will, but not quite at this level with this level of visibility. And there's a real excitement about driving GAVI into the next stage of its life. And you can kind of look at GAVI as having, going through its stages, from the earliest stages where it was, an explosion of creativity and enthusiasm, but not so many systems and mechanisms, to really maturing and building in a lot of mechanisms and governance structures and stuff, but maybe at the loss of some of its creativity, to sort of this next phase, which will be the merger of it all. And so I think it's with that vision that the whole world is joining hands in excitement around taking this initiative forward further. Thank you.
Okay, I invite our panelists then to come up to the table, and we'll have someone come out with a microphone. If you could raise your hand. In blue here on the right. Right over here. We'll gather, let's say, 5 questions and comments, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
Thank you so much. My name is Judith Rius, and I'm the U.S. manager of the Access to Essential Medicines campaign of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. This has been a very interesting panel, and I have so many things to say that it's going to be difficult for me to summarize it.
Keep yourself to 2 minutes. Okay, that's
2 minutes.
That's our rule, so that we can keep the movement.
The first point that I will make, and with the hope of not being too critical, is that I think this is a very interesting conversation. You have very high-level people in the panel and very informed positions, but I think it will be good for the future to have somebody in the panel who provides maybe a different perspective, maybe more critical on the current systems and the way it works. Maybe somebody from civil society, or even from a developing country, who are basically the main beneficiaries. They're supposed to be the main beneficiaries of these mechanisms. And in general, as I'm sure you well know, Doctors Without Borders have quite a critic position on the design of the advanced market commitment, not on the idea of the advanced market commitment, and not at all on GAVI. We understand the benefits of having this kind of conversations. We just have some concerns on the final design of the advanced market commitment. And we think there were basically a lot of compromises that were made in the final design, and we think these compromises could have been avoided and could be avoided if GAVI undergoes some governance reform. I have the excuse me. I have some documentation with me that I would love to share with you. There are some of our proposals, but basically 3 grand lines, and it's basically a question and a comment to the panelists. First, the conflicts of interest that cause the fact that pharmaceutical companies are part of the GAVI board at this moment, and basically one of our asks with other organizations is pharmaceutical companies should not be part of the GAVI board because they're basically beneficiary in the AMC of a subsidy, not to innovation, but yes, to escalate production. So we think part of the idea that they're beneficiaries of this subsidy makes them ineligible to be part of the board of GAVI. The second is the issue of price transparency. We know that from AIDS and other diseases, we have benefited a lot from having more transparency on the prices that institutions pay for the final products. It will be good. We think that GAVI used this opportunity to announce some government reforms that include more transparency on the pricing. And third, this idea that tier pricing, that's basically the concept behind the advanced market commitment, is the solution to guarantee long-term sustainability and access to the final products is, as you know, in their strong criticism and strong discussion among other forums at the World Health Organization, where there is an expert working group on innovative financing and incentive mechanisms that's currently discussing incentive mechanisms that link or separate the cost of R&D from the price of the final products, and they promote competition and a variety of sources of supply. So why GAVI, or if GAVI is considering, my question would be, is GAVI considering, and the promoters of the IMC and new incentive mechanisms, these three ideas, basically avoiding conflicts of interest, increasing levels of transparency on the prices, and exploring incentive mechanisms that rely on a strong competition and rely on the link in the cost of R&D from the price of the product.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being so concise. Can I collect 4 more? Other comments, questions? Come on, guys. You're getting close to the end. And the green?
So the question has to Michael Kremer about his argument about sort of using all of the funding at the beginning rather than thinking about additional entrants to market. If I understood what you were saying we could have gotten more benefit by releasing all the AMC funds quickly. And I just wanted to ask the panel to comment on this sort of long-term supply and keeping prices down over the foreseeable future by having more manufacturers in the AMC versus the argument that Michael Kremer was making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Others? Okay, well, let's take a round of response and maybe people will get inspired. We'll start with Michael.
Great, thanks. So I can't really comment on the issue of pharma companies on the GAVI board. I don't think, pharma companies were not part of the expert groups that certainly I was involved in. On the price transparency, certainly the advanced market commitment, it's up on the web what the prices are. So I think the advanced market commitments are transparent. More generally, there is a principle in industrial organization, the study of markets and economics, that often sometimes firms can collude by having their prices published. So they're obviously, because then they can immediately find if anybody's making a discount, and they can use that to keep prices high. So it's not unambiguous. Obviously, in many settings, there's a huge corruption danger, and then publishing prices is good. With GAVI, that doesn't seem. You might think that that's not the primary consideration. Thanks very much. On the issue of tiered pricing and on the issue of competition, I think we can all agree that competition is very desirable. The question is, what stage does the competition come in? And the competition it depends a lot on the specifics of the industry, whether it makes sense to have the competition on a day-to-day basis in a spot market context. So let me be a little bit more specific. You're thinking about an industry where you need a huge upfront investment, and then the cost of production is much lower for each additional unit. Then it doesn't necessarily make sense to structure the competition all on a spot market basis. So an obvious example of that is electricity. Okay, we need electricity. Is the solution, and we need just like vaccines, although less importantly, we need a reliable supply of electricity. It takes a lot of work to build an electric power plant. It's a huge expense. So is the solution to say, let's build 10 times as many electric power plants as we need to satisfy, we install capacity to satisfy 10 times the market need, and then let's have competition. Well, that's somebody ultimately has to pay for it. You know, we all like to get more than $1 from $1 worth of investment, and sometimes that's possible, but there's also a principle that eventually things have to be paid for. So if you're going to install 10 times as much electric capacity and build all those factories, ultimately society has to pay for it. Similarly, so having the competition at the end of the game, and in a spot market sense, is a very expensive thing to get because you have to cause those investments to be made in the first place. Similarly, for vaccines, I think we've relied on this model of saying the old way of doing things was very short-run contracts. We're going to buy vaccines on a short-run contract, an annual contract for 1 year's worth of supply. Well, then you think, well, we have to subsidize a lot of capacity creation, so we get firms out there with the capacity to produce more than we need, and then that's the only way we're going to get a decent price. Because obviously, if you've only got a small amount of capacity, a competition isn't really going to reduce the price. Well, I think I think it's important to think about, is that really the best way to do it? We can free things up a lot by moving away from that model of lots of short-run contracts where ultimately you're going to have to pay for it anyway by building up capacity that you don't need, perhaps inefficiently. An alternative is to say, let's have a long-run contract. We'll still have the competition, but we'll have the competition up front for who gets that long-run contract. That's one way to think about what the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus is through that. Now look, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the whole market should be allocated once and for all, we're going to allocate the whole GAVI market in one fell swoop. But there's roughly 200 million doses that are going to be needed. Okay. The decision, I thought that all the things I had seen had talked about allocating 100 million doses of supply. The early things that I had seen, I think this was a compromise that was made was probably made in the wrong direction. They were going to allocate 100 million doses initially, and then put up for bid the next 100 million doses. I think that next 100 million doses would have been plenty for to motivate other vaccine manufacturers. Also, as I understood it, and I don't know the final design, there isn't a commitment. The companies make a commitment. They're going to be stand ready to supply at $3.50 a dose in the tail period. But that doesn't mean that GAVI's obligated to buy from them. If in fact GAVI, another supplier comes along who can supply at $1 a dose, GAVI can buy from them. So if there is somebody out there who's got a, I think there would have been plenty of incentive to develop new products, plenty of incentive to have additional entrants in the long run with 100 million doses reserved. And with the prospect of if you can beat the $3.50 price, then you can get the whole market potentially. I don't think for some sort of hypothetical benefit we should have said we're gonna take a big risk of what I showed on those projections, which is countries willing to introduce the vaccine, kids dying from the disease, and not being able to get the vaccine for them because we wanted to hold on to the market. So I would have said, allocate half the market now, half the market later on.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Sorry for the
David,
long answer.
do you want to, or Helen?
So, on the governance issues, I'll leave that to Helen to address. To pick up on Michael's discussion and the question of, the quantities under the AMC, I would just say two things. The first is, I think I'm right in saying, as an empirical matter, Amanda, if you take a look at the history of all of the vaccines that GAVI has been involved in, what's happened is that you've had this phenomenon where, the market has been increased by GAVI agglomerating demand. More suppliers have come to that particular market. At the beginning stages, the prices sort of trended upwards slightly probably, or stayed where it is. And then as you get more market entrants, the price has trended downwards. So the AMC, I think, is in a sense, is a pressure cooker environment where it's trying to foreshorten that whole process. That's one observation to make. Now, having said that, I think that the fundamental point that Michael makes is around a very difficult judgment call, and one could make it either way. That's, I think, is the fundamental point. It's a judgment call, and I think it's difficult to talk about right or wrong here, but that is an important input. I think the next thing to say is just at a theoretical level as well as at an empirical level. You're right. I mean, there is, the market for pneumo is neither a market for electricity nor is it a market for toothpaste. Market for electricity being one where it's characterized by and large, in most countries, competition for the market rather than competition in the market, and the market for toothpaste being competition in the market, a full spot market. Market for vaccines is not quite either of those, but I think what, in my mind, one way to look at the AMC is that it's moving you from a world where you start with competition for the market, and you're quite right, particularly when you're looking at long-term supply, that's awfully important, but hopefully you get to a point where it drifts more towards a spot market, where you have sufficient competition in the market that it looks more like a spot market. And some electricity markets have obviously traveled that journey, not all the way to toothpaste, but and sometimes with end runs in the middle. But I mean, they have. So that's the next thing I would say. And the final thing I would say is that one of the elements that goes into making the judgment call, and I'm not defending it, I'm just saying one of the elements that goes into the judgment call about how much do you call for, how much do you contract, is the credibility behind that. And bear in mind the AMC is partly the 1.5 billion that is collected in the donor AMC pool. But as you know, the other part is what comes through GAVI funds. And GAVI is precisely, as Helen said, we're in the middle of a replenishment round. So there's only so much that we can credibly stand behind, and we need to transmit that credibility to industry if these calls for proposals are actually going to hold.
Helen.
Thanks. Yes, a couple of comments. I mean, we're very, very aware with MSF's concerns. I think in terms of governance, GAVI is a public-private partnership, and the principle of a public-private partnership is you put all the key players around the table, and this is about vaccines. So there was a decision made that there should be manufacturers represented in the public-private partnership, that's GAVI, and then you manage the conflicts of interest by a strong conflict of interest policy about where it's appropriate for a person to be involved in the discussions and where it's not appropriate for them to be involved in the discussions. I think looking at conflict of interest is something that the board is looking at on an ongoing basis. There's a retreat next week, and I know that conflict of interest generally and how we manage it in both the board and the committees is something the board will be addressing. But I think with a public-private partnership, with the principle of putting all the players around the table, there are inevitably conflicts. It's how you manage those conflicts. One could argue that you shouldn't have developing countries on the board because they're recipients. One could argue, a range. We have WHO and UNICEF on the board. They also receive GAVI funds. So it's a question of how you manage those conflicts. So I think that's what I would comment there. In terms of price transparency, UNICEF is the procurement agent for GAVI, and UNICEF, we've had discussions with them over the last period. All the prices are on the UNICEF website now. The GAVI prices are there. So going forward, any contracts will have it as part of the contract that those prices will be on the UNICEF website. And to have retrospective prices up there, it requires the manufacturer's approval because it's a retrospective decision. But we are indeed with UNICEF, our procurement agent, making sure transparency, bearing in mind Michael's comments about there are downsides of that transparency as well. I don't think I'll comment. I'm not an economist myself, and I think that Michael has more than adequately covered that, and David has also covered it. But I just think perhaps an example of judgment calls, and there's no right or wrong answer, was Michael's comment about too small a volume in terms of going out, and the decision that was made, as I understand it, was to allow capacity for other manufacturers to come in. I know there's been some concern expressed that the tender at the time went to the two big pharma companies. They happened to be the only companies at that time who met the qualification requirements and who had the capacity to produce the volume we wanted, because supply has been a problem. But by not releasing all the volume over the long term, that allows capacity. We're going out to tender again in the next couple of months, actually, and we'll go out several times more, which gives the capacity for new manufacturers to come in, and we understand there are a couple of emerging market manufacturers coming in, and it also gives the opportunity for the price to go down. But once again, there's a downside to it. So I think this is about judgment calls.
Want to say anything on that topic? Okay, or do we have last questions from the audience, or? Okay, well, let's wrap up then. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think this was a very substantive discussion that laid out some key issues and set out the challenges that you're facing going ahead. So thanks very much for coming, and thanks to the audience for coming. Thank you.